Thank you to Eric for making this possible. I know a lot of professional development in our field relies on volunteer efforts, and this actually is a really fun one for me to do. I teach at San Francisco State University. I work with master's students on a regular basis. I do get to go out into the field as part of student teaching and as part of collaborative projects with teachers at City College of San Francisco, but it's always really a lot of fun for me to be able to interact with a great diversity of teachers all at one spot. So this NGEL thing is enviably a cool thing going on your part of the country. Um, I'm not going to go into the abstract because I think you guys chose it perhaps based on that and on the title. I'm going to walk you through in the next hour in a very quick way, and it's actually kind of a tease to get you exposed to what was established in the early 90s and was used as a professional development framework called Learners' Lives as Curriculum. This normally is a 2-day workshop, so we're going to fly through an introduction in an hour. Some of you may already be familiar with some of the materials based on this framework, but my real goal today is to get everyone excited about using the framework and exchanging ideas about how they're going to take this into their own practice. And I put my email there because I really am curious about people who are familiar with this framework and have opportunities either in collaboration with teachers or with their program to use it as a basis for curricular reform. So here's what, whoops, Eric, my thing doesn't, do I have full control over the screen?
You do, yep. So you just go forward as if it's your own slideshow. So go
Oh,
down to, there you go.
okay, that's okay. So here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna do a quick warm-up exercise just to get everyone connecting with one another about the possibilities around learners' lives in our curriculum. I'm gonna then move quickly to a tribute to the original creator of this curriculum framework, Gail Weinstein, who I know David knows very well. The going to walk you through a very quick overview of the framework by walking you through the anatomy of a lesson, some sample activities, strategies for generating more stories. I have a quick comment to make about this kind of pedagogical work as a basis for language acquisition, which is a research dimension of this work, and then throw it open to some Q&A. And as Eric mentioned, there's going to be lots of opportunities for you guys to interact as we go throughout the hour. And here is your first opportunity. I know some of you are working with a partner or in a group of people, so this will be fun for you. If you're not working with anybody directly right now, you'll still do this, but just pretend as if you were working with somebody. I'm going to show you a close, which is a fill in the blank exercise. There are no right answers or wrong answers. Just have fun, and this is only a partial exercise that we would do in a real workshop, but here it is. I'm going to give you guys, let's say, I don't know, I'm going to give you all of about 90 seconds to come up with answers. And if you could just choose, is there a way, Eric, to divide them up A, B, C, D? Like I see there's about 20 participants.
I think anybody that's on their own can kind of choose what they want, but maybe in a setting where there's multiple people, they can divide amongst themselves, like A, B, C, and D.
Okay, so go ahead, and then Eric, they can if they can write in, they can just go A and type in their
Yes.
sentences.
Yep. And the person from Delaware was from Dover.
Oh, that's 40 minutes for me
Yeah.
on a good traffic day.
Yeah.
To take about 40 more seconds.
And then Maricel, once you close it, I'll read some of them out.
Okay.
I always talk about on these webinars the wait time. When you're in a classroom, you can see people working. When you're on a webinar, you presume people are working.
think it's a good presumption on this part.
Yeah. All right. So why don't I
Yeah,
read some? All
yeah.
right. So Timothy says, "I'm just a poor part-time man." Janice has, "I'm just a poor part-time and volunteer reading grant application until dawn."
Awesome.
And book Timothy had said reading books until dawn. David had said, "I'm just a poor part-time and minimum wager. I'm reading my bills until dawn." David, that sounds like a song you might sing.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think it is.
Babette said, "I'm just a poor part-time and English teacher. I'm reading student papers until dawn,
Awesome.
or student books until dawn." All right, so I think you get a flavor of
Yeah,
where
yeah,
people are
yeah.
going with it.
So this is great. And in a real workshop, you would have more time. And there's actually three parts to this close activity where you get to fill out sentences like this. And then we, of course, would begin to share it. And part of what we're modeling right here is how you jumpstart both a writing process, but also a personal exchange process. And as you guys quickly showed in about 90 seconds, we can relate to some of these words in a very strong and uh, direct way. Here's what it really is, the original. This is not, of course, the right and only version, but this is when Gail was alive, she would sing this, and I will not do that. But there is a series that shows, and Babette, I think, was the one that said, "I'm a part-time English teacher or reading English essays until dawn." But of course, the idea of a scholar in the middle of the night and somebody reading grant applications fits here as well. One of the reasons why this my sorry, Eric, my there you go. It's a little delayed.
Okay.
One of the reasons why I feel this curricular framework is so powerful is because of the way it immediately inspires engagement in classrooms. And I think um, a prompt that we just saw, which immediately connects individuals around the challenges of being a part-time teacher in our field, has resonance and both immediately gets you want to say more and to exchange with others because of the common experience. And that, I think, is fundamental to what Gail invested a lot of her energy in. She left us much too early in life, having suffered through ovarian cancer in the last 5 years of her life, but in that time was very adamant that this curricular framework be passed on to others. She had no proprietary allegiance other than she wanted teachers to be using it. So consider this hour your authority to become part of the learners' lives as curricular framework users and developers, and start to see it as a way of thinking about your own practice. She really felt that telling our stories to one another is one way of making sense of our experience and finding support to deepen and sustain our work. And in this quotation, it's not just that using learners' lives as the basis for curricular development was great pedagogy, but it was also great professional development.
Maricel,
Yeah.
Janet, do you have a question or a thought? I see your hand is up. Nope. Okay.
Okay, so here I just really quickly, um, some of you may, you may be familiar with these books. They've actually been around since the 90s. All of them are now out of print, unfortunately. So you could probably find them on used book uh, vendors, but a lot of these books have not been reissued. There have been some individuals around the country. I can think of folks in Pennsylvania and one in California and Arizona where they are thinking of generating new materials using the framework. And I can say with confidence that would make Gail very happy. So if in fact this inspires a publishing interest of yours, I say you reach out to us and we can help you link with others who have thought of doing the same. Just as a way of introducing the framework, here were some core beliefs, and these have been culled from Gail's writings and her professional talks, that why she thought that using stories, and when I mean the word stories, I don't mean that in any kind of over technical way, such as a plot or a book story. She really did mean a learner's snippet of life, a learner's um, sample of writing that gave insight into the things that were important to them in their everyday lives. She saw that the opportunity for getting learners, even at the beginning levels of ESL instruction, bringing that material into the classroom would not only help create community among the students, would enable the curriculum to connect to students' lives outside. And I know Eric has worked on that, this bringing the world outside the classroom into the classroom has very much informed his work as a way of motivating students and keeping them persisting in their language learning because learning continues to be engaging to them, and also to enable them to focus on how to say and what to say. So another way of saying that in more technical terms is thinking about the form that language takes, but also the meaning that language holds for them as they try to express what they want to say. And in a very reduced way, I think of the aspects that have always drawn me to this framework and to the work that has grown out of it is that it's not magical because this has to be intentional work. But when done well and collaboratively with others, you really do get to see signs of true engagement and joy in the classroom. And not only that, we are engaged and we are joyful in our teaching. The teachers that I have met who have been inspired by this framework and use it to fuel their own syllabus development are happy teachers. And we all know, as you showed in the first 90 seconds with that close activity, that there are many reasons for that to be chipped away at. So finding ways to discover joy in our teaching and classroom learning is so important and was certainly a core piece of what made this framework powerful. What I want to walk you through now is what a lesson looks like. And again, maybe you can do this off to the side, Eric, if there's a way to find out how many folks actually have taught with collaborations or stories to tell stories to tell our children. And I'll just keep going, but I would like to know what people have already been exposed to.
Sure. If you recognize that curriculum, stories to tell our children, you can send me a question in, or if you've worked with the Learners Labs' curriculum directly, why don't you let me know via the question area?
Yeah, or the textbook collaborations. That
Yeah.
will also be another way. So I want to show you the writing process, which you've already somewhat just experienced, in which I gave you a prompt. I invited you to fill in the words, and by filling in some of the words, we started to draft your own personal take on what it's like to be a part-time professional in this world. And in sharing, we started to hear about one another's stories. I will show you how that can become the basis for a learner-centered lesson. And at the end, I'll propose some strategies for finding more learner stories to bring into your classroom. So as I was just referring to the writing process, the inspiring point is what to write about and how to get students writing. And as Gail's Port Part-Timing Teacher song was always without fail, going and touching upon the struggles of teachers was a surefire way to get teachers talking to one another. And we all could imagine what it's like to be up reading grant applications, reading essays, and reading lots of text in the middle of the night. So finding this common experience as the basis for drafting and revising an idea. What we might do after that is to get you to collectively pool your ideas. So I might ask you to do a group essay, which is looking at that the way you answered the close, and ask you to work together in groups of 3 or 4 to write a group essay, and then a story would emerge about the things that you love about being an ESL practitioner and the things that you find concerning and bothersome or downright infuriating. But again, in the workshop, within a matter of 15 minutes, we have a collective story emerging. And so thinking about ways that a story can begin individually, but through sharing around a common experience, you have a group essay that becomes a story that's held up for more discussion and more reading in classroom activities. And this is that same information, but just shown that this is very much a cycle. Stories can come into the classroom, personal experiences, personal questions, personal routines can come in and become material that can be revised and drafted. Gail used to be very good at talking to teachers and talking to learners where you could ask them. That was so interesting what you said the other day about not being able to find the favorite ingredients of your food in the grocery store. Do you mind if I write that up to use in the classroom tomorrow so that we can use it as reading material? Was very good at listening to what was going on in her learners in the learners' lives, and as an opportunity to bring that into the drafting process.
And Maricel, as part of that, I think it's really important to reiterate what you had said earlier. Then, when we're thinking about story, you're not just thinking about something with an overt plot, right, or
That's
something that comes fully formed. It's something that a learner is experiencing, is something a learner is thinking about, and has an idea that may be interesting to share, and it may not take the form of a story right away, right? And it
yeah,
may
and
be the drafting and the revising and the talking where all of a sudden it takes the shape of something that's going to clearly be shared, but it's not going to come, to their head right away as a story.
absolutely. And I think that can be daunting to say, today we're going to write a story in the classroom, where the students might feel that this has to be a very developed um, process. It's not. It's a matter of finding what's of interest to your learners and what learners are interested in talking about together. So very quickly motoring along here. Do you have a sense of anybody who's taught collaborations, Eric?
Some.
Some. Okay. So those of you who have taught collaborations are going to recognize this anatomy. There are four basic components to a learner-centered lesson that builds on a learner's life story. Reading and reacting to the story, mastering the language of the story, often called playing with language, generating new language to tell new stories, and comparing experiences for reflection and action. So with each of these steps, the goal is to take the initial snippet and keep drilling down, allowing the significance, allowing the number of stories that are associated to expand, so that the text takes on a life of its own through discussion and more language play in the classroom. So just as an example, and the examples in this presentation today are all some of my most favorite stories that have emerged from the materials from the books, or ones that I have developed directly with teachers as part of projects that have had a focus on health. And so this was a very popular one. It comes from collaborations, and I'm going to read it aloud. This is Mrs. Cascioio's story. When we got to America, my sons began to grow faster. Sports and American food made them grow tall. Before in Laos, they liked our food and they ate everything. Now they don't like Lao food anymore. They like McDonald's and they drink lots of Pepsi. So this is a great story in that it immediately gets, particularly in family literacy settings when you have parents, immediately talking about um, everyday family dynamics, things that are comfortable, things they may even have vocabulary for already. Um, but you can also see that this enables them to talk about life now and life before, which of course is central to the immigrant experience. Um, as I said, it's a four-part structure. The first thing that they do is got to get the students to read the story. And for many of you who may teach in very low level, where reading itself, even with these not so complex sentences, can still be complex. So I'm going to come back to that when I talk about how do you do this with really low level learners. But listening to the story is important. In a Typically, I wouldn't have even shown you the text yet. I would have read it aloud a couple times, perhaps just showing you the picture. Then we might have read it. I might have read it and did the model reading. I might have done a choral reading with you. But again, exposing the learners to the text so that they can hear it and see it multiple times. I may ask them to do pair work so they can read it again. And what you're trying to do is to make sure that they are all familiar with the same text. Um, if you want to make it more challenging for students who are in the room, you can tell them, I'm going to make two mistakes, and you read it with two things. You could make her from Cambodia, or make her from, or change how many children she has, and see if the learners can find the mistake. And that's a way of making it more challenging for the more advanced students in the class, but keeping it accessible to those who are still practicing multiple reads. The part of the reacting is coming up with the questions that will help engage them in the meaning of the story. This is a very, very common routine in Gail's books, is comparing what your life is like to the stories that you find in the book. How is your family like this family? How is your family different? Do you have a story like Ms. Cascioio's story? I've used this story probably half a dozen times in many different settings, and without fail, this story and this question immediately jumpstarts discussion in the classroom. After the students have had an opportunity to read the story, begins the mastering the language. And by mastering the language, you're trying to get the students to focus on how the story is told and the language that is used to tell the story. And more overtly, it's going to look like grammar practice. It's going to look like vocabulary practice. But we say playing with the language and mastering the language because you want to see the students begin to see that the structures that are used to tell Mrs. Casciolio's story can be manipulated to tell other people's stories. And that represents your first bridge to using that as a scaffold to generating new material, which is ultimately where you want to get your learners to go to. I'm going to show you a traditional close, which is a very common activity used in collaborations. Let me show you the close first. And so here it is. We deleted the verbs, some key verbs, and we would ask students in the same way that you did the part-timing teacher to try and figure what the words are. To make it more accessible for the lower level students in the class, you could give them the missing words. For the students who are more advanced, you could have them not give them the words and see if they can think of the original word and other words that might go into those blanks. But other ways of playing with the language is you could take the story, cut it up into strips, and tell the students to put the story in the right order, which tests their comprehension. And as I said earlier, you could provide them with a word list depending on how challenging you want it to be. And one of the principles in the way this framework is applied is the idea is to adjust the task that the learners are being given, not the text, because you want the text to build the common experience. Sometimes we think of, oh, we'll just give the advanced students the whole text and we'll just give some of the learners just a portion of it. But then the lower level learners don't get the full experience. So the idea is to challenge yourself to think about ways you can adjust the task, like giving them a list of words versus not giving them the list of words, instead of changing the text. Here's another way once we've given them opportunities to look at the language of the story, to use the story to generate new vocabulary. And this is, it could be very easy to do this based on the content. This mother probably had words that she could associate with the the quote-unquote U.S. American food, and words that she would associate with Laotian food. Here's a grammar lesson that also enables them to start generating other language to tell other stories. If you looked at the story, there's the use of irregular and irregular verbs, and it enables them to talk about the past and the present, but also focusing on the grammatical accuracy of their sentences. And there's formulaic, there's expressions below. In my country, I ate blank, but now I eat blank. So there's meaningful recycling of the same structures. So I'm going to stop here, and I want to look at this story again and see if we can get 2 or 3 new ideas that you see by looking at this story. What are some other ways you could play with the language in this story? Eric, are you still there?
I am still here, so if people have thoughts and questions, they can put them along that way.
Just take 2 and then we'll move on.
Yeah. So I think one of the ideas here is that the idea of different foods is very generative, right? And so what other contrasts, what other changes do you see in the story that would be similarly generative?
Or what aspects of grammar or aspects of vocabulary would you see as up for language play as you try to familiarize them with the text?
David's talking about David Rosen's talking about family health or traditional or Western medicine.
Yeah. So even though this is about food, it would be the basis to getting them to respond to what are other ways that you feel that American systems are replacing what you Laotian traditions.
Angela said that you could use some comprehension questions around this. Carmen's talking about grammar, how to make positive to negative, or maybe culturally positive to negative. Roxy's talking about changing the word or order of sentences and have the students make corrections. Babette's talking about different sports and maps. Carolyn talks about putting it in the past tense. When we lived in Laos before we came to America, these sorts of grammatical shifts.
Oh, excellent. I really like that one. Yeah. Okay, excellent. So again, there was a range in your suggestions around reacting to the content, but also using the language in a very productive way to get them to use um, to think more generatively about the language they already know. So the experience is familiar. Now we're going to look at different ways of changing sentences to express the same ideas. So the fourth component of that anatomy was to use the experiences for reflection and action, and that's already indicated in some of the ideas you had, where you were comparing health systems or comparing traditions. Um, and here this could be the basis for uh, small group work, small discussion, individual presentations, individual essays. You could have students generate posters for an oral presentation to give to the class, like as a poster walk around, where they could talk about family habits that are changing, which ones feel like good changes and which ones feel like not so good changes, and why. One of the things to remember is once you realize a story has resonance, you have to start thinking about what are my learners going to want to say and anticipate the need for what kind of language they will need to learn in order to be able to say that. So this idea, when we looked at this story, we said they're going to want to talk about habits that they used to have. And so the expression used to is going to be very useful. The past tense, as someone just mentioned, and the different ways of expressing past tense, before, chronological markers. So anticipating how is this story going to be resonant for my students will then help you as a teacher decide what language should I build into my lesson plan. And that way you really start to feel that you're both balancing the integration of language instruction with the meaningful expression of its application. Here is this slide. I'm going to walk you through the principles that undergirded learner-centered teaching. And hopefully, as I show you each of these six, you will see ways that just that small snippet of Mrs. Kashoya's story, that these principles come to life. And the first one is that teachers need to take an inquiring stance, that you have to know what's going on in your learners' lives outside school. And that has become so endemic in our thinking in teaching and adult literacy teaching in general, but how often we don't give ourselves an opportunity to know all the students in a more full way. And so asking students, in what ways are your lives changing, in what ways feel good and bad, demonstrates your curiosity, but also puts you in a good position to bring that material into the classroom. Build on what learners know is the second principle. Provide opportunities to integrate the past with the present. Regardless of the number of years of residence in this country, I think one of the universals about many of the students in our ESL programs is they have a very keen sense of way things are changing in their lives and don't always have an opportunity to see that documented and celebrated and discussed, and work through if there are places of struggle. And you can see that this example, and I've seen countless numbers of times, parents love to talk about ways that their kids are not upholding their traditions and trying to figure out ways to struggle through that in a common dynamic. Balancing skills and structures with meaning making and knowledge creation. And your last few examples demonstrate this. You're trying to bring in the need to develop more vocabulary, more control over English grammar, more control over longer stretches of discourse, because to tell these snippets, you need to be able to get beyond the phrase and have more vocabulary and a sense of time, the grammar you need to be able to express different points in time with the meaning making that's associated with that. And the beautiful thing here, of course, is they've lived the experience. They are just looking for opportunities to be able to express it and see it in English. And so being able to see yourself in your lesson plans balancing the need for both form and meaning is is the heart of principle number 3. Authenticity in texts and tasks. This is a whole discussion unto itself, but the idea of bringing a real world experience into the classroom is the goal, and that there's an authenticity in parents being able to exchange ideas with one another, or being able to comment about their lives beforehand. If you think about the number of parenting blogs that are out there about healthy eating and being able to ensure that your children are growing up in a healthy way, our learners need opportunities to do that as well. And I think stories like this one make that task very authentic, and being able to do it regardless of the level of English that you have, also an authentic and legitimate exercise. We see this less so in the example that I showed, but the foster learner agency through choices, learner control, and documented mastery has to do with the idea of what are the topics you want to talk about, and let's allow that to drive your acquisition of English forms and structures. So being able to give choices to learners. So in this lesson, you might have asked, you're each going to pick one way that your lives have changed for the good and maybe not so for the good. And it can have to do with health or traditions or medicine. But again, fostering that learner agency through choices will make the stories more meaningful for the learners. And finally, as you have already seen, and we've talked about with even the part-timing teacher, the goal is not that there are to remain at the individual story sharing part. The goal is to come to a sense of collective understanding of what makes our stories similar, what makes them diversely representative of a whole host of experiences, but it's that building around community that not only brings a coherence to the students in the class as they get to know one another, but of course among the teacher as well. So really quickly, we don't really have time to go through all of these, but I just want to invite you to write in and talk about ways that these principles are at work already in your classroom practice, and ways that you're already starting to think about that you'd like to build in more purposeful thinking about one of these principles around stories. So maybe write in to Eric, and if you can just let me know how they're answering. Right, one principle that already you feel like is at work in a strong and you feel very confident using in your practice, and one principle that you'd like to think about more.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it. Things that have been fairly easy for you to realize in your classroom, and things that you have prioritized to develop a little bit more. And then I can share those with everybody as they start to come in. You know, as I said at the top of the hour, we're going to be sending out the PDF of this. So I think you could use these principles to either generate your own programs list, to adapt these, and to use a similar sort of rubric to reflect on your own practice at the program level. One of the things we know about professional development is that it's really best at a sort of a cohort, local, project-based level. So, to take some of these ideas and bring them back to your program and try to work through them. So Linda is saying that they do an inventory wheel at the start where students name what they need in English the most, who they want to talk to in those places, and what they want to tell or ask these people, like a doctor in a clinic. So trying to get the learners to really identify the contexts and the people that they're going to be needing to speak English in. I think that's a really important step, because when it's left at a general thing, students are going to say English. I need English, or I want English. But as Linda was saying, what kind of English, where, speaking to who?
Great. Are people still thinking, Eric?
I think people are still thinking and typing. Yeah, so we can give them a second about this. And I think, one of the things that you mentioned here in 4, the strive for authenticity in texts and tasks. Some of the work that I did at NICSAL, the former Adult Literacy Research Center, was on this idea of authenticity. Right. And, one of the ways that we really talked about it was using texts in the same way they would use them outside in the real world. So When you read a newspaper, you read a newspaper to get information. You don't read a newspaper to look for examples of long and short A, right? And
Yes.
so that's
Yes.
not really the way that we use newspapers. So Roxy's saying that they use forms and papers as curriculum. Certainly. We had a webinar a couple weeks ago about using government documents and how difficult and complex some government documents are for learners and those helping learners to understand. So certainly forms and authentic texts are really important. Okay, maybe we'll give people another 30 seconds or so to finish up with their typing and then we can move on. Kathy, for number two, is saying they discussed the situation in Nigeria regarding women with the women from a student from the country. They did some Google research for students who wanted more and discussed the comparisons between cultures. So certainly something like what's happening in Nigeria, if it's your homeland or if it hits home, it's good. You're going to want to be able to talk about that in class. Babette's saying all the principles were used prior to the GED 2014 and ESL and GED 2002 series classes where the writing was more personal. Now it's looking at outside sources, not personal lives, right? So the shifting of the nature of the high school equivalency tests may
Great.
impact the types of things that people are doing inside the class. Um, Roxy notes that the teacher sets the stage by sharing your story with the students. I always found that's really important. Jenna says that they start with discussion questions. What's helpful or difficult about having teenagers? They talk about that for 15 minutes, then they talk about the vocabulary and the problems that come from that. She says that number one and number six are easy. So that taking an inquiring stance and building the community is easy. And Carolyn says, use the words from the stories as sight words so it's their own words, interests, and goals.
Great. This is terrific. So we have a group already with super instincts that resonate. And one of the things that Gail and I used to always talk about, she used to say, "Oh, for Pete's sake, this is not rocket science. This has to do with what do you know about your learners and how does it drive your curriculum." But the principles weren't that complex. She said, "You know, I'm not sure." She couldn't understand why. She couldn't understand why people had this framework in such awe for a while because she said, you know, it's not that complex in concept, but in practice. And as I hear this, you know, this reference to the GED and how it's putting new pressures on the classroom, it's in the practice is how do we make this happen, where I think there's a lot more work to be done. I wonder what I'm going to try to do because I'm looking at time and I see we have about 15 minutes. Is that correct, Eric?
Yeah, we
Or
have
maybe
about 15 minutes or so.
I'm just going to do a whirlwind. I'm just going to throw a bunch of lessons up here just to make a few points about the kinds of stories and the kinds of activities. Stories don't have to be tragic, problematic. They don't have to be, there's no criterion around that. They can be their opinions about things that help to jumpstart discussion because these are the things that matter to them. This is one of my favorite ones as they think about, you know, how parental relationships can shift or how social relationships can shift as you learn English or as your people in your family learn English faster than you. I help my kids, I teach them good things, I play with them, I protect them and I correct them. My kids help me too. They bring me things, they teach me English. My kids make me happy. Maybe they will take care of me when I grow old. And I love that last sentence because again, in family literacy programs that I've worked at, this jumpstarts a lot of discussion about ways that their kids are changing and evolving faster than the parents are sometimes able to keep up with. And as a parent of a teenager, I can totally relate to this, and I speak my child's first language. Again, you see this close. This one was a great one for looking at pronouns, which again is um, going back to this idea of here's where accuracy does matter. It does matter which pronoun you choose because to tell the story that's most faithful to Gabray's experience, you need to choose the right pronoun. So again, the balancing of structure and form. Sorry, structure and meaning. You can use the story to generate new language to tell new stories. What are other ways that people give help and get help? That is an interesting contrast that can help develop new vocabulary. Here's another story. about English learning. I like to read and listen. I like to do everything in this class, but I'm nervous because I don't speak. I need more help. And this is written by a very low-level student, um, most likely on one of the first couple weeks of class as part of needs assessment activity. But this is the idea that inviting your students early on to talk about when are you nervous in this class, when are you relaxed, and using this story as not only an opportunity to talk about prior learning experiences, but also for the student to get assessed about ways they like to learn. And this is an exercise that can follow up on that story where you can actually assess what students are used to doing as they think about doing school and becoming familiar with the way English is taught and new interactional dynamics.
And I actually think,
As I,
Marcel, can you go back to that slide for a second?
yeah, yeah,
Actually, I think this is a really important point because there are times when your students' expectation about what school looks like and what class looks like may run counter to the types of things that you're talking about here. So if a student has a model of learning that's very teacher focused
absolutely.
or is very driven by the idea of a textbook, when you're talking about generating texts from their lives and texts and lessons from their classmates' lives, they may be uncomfortable. You know, they may have questions about whether this is school or whether this is teaching. And
Exactly.
so I
That's
think,
when when the talk gets very personalized, they might just start to feel, is this English class anymore? Is this why is she constantly telling me about her life? Why is that important here?
right. And why don't I have a tech? Why aren't we using side by side? Right.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think having students talk about what they think school looks like is really important to kind of be upfront about that.
Yeah, and I think this lesson is a great one because they don't even realize that they're sharing stories. They just think they're giving their opinions about the way school should be carried out. So, as I mentioned briefly earlier, have used Learner's Lives as a curriculum as a framework for a lot of work that I've done in the development of health-themed ESL lessons, and a part of a larger preventive health research study looking at the ways that ESL classrooms are places for improving preventive awareness campaigns. And one of the projects looked at lead poisoning, which is lead poisoning prevention is a very serious concern in Central California, where there is a lot of import of foods from around the world which may contain high levels of lead. So as part of that, we worked with a group of ESL programs to generate stories, and this is one of them. Um, and again, another example of where stories come from. It was in collaboration with a public health entity that we realized that their brochures that were being sent to the public were not culturally or culturally responsive or even linguistically responsive because many of them were in English. Um, and using the ESL context, we thought stories might be a good way to create an alternative avenue. This story is about a wife who's worried about using a chimolera, which is a clay pot like a mortar pestle thing, to grind chile for making food. And she doesn't want to use the pot anymore, and her husband says, why not? It's tradition that we should use it. We grew up eating from clay pots. And wow, what a great opportunity to engage students in discussions around issues they had heard about in the press but weren't necessarily being included in public dialogues. In that particular project, we looked very closely at what reading and reacting might involve, and we used a framework that ask students to describe what's going on, to interpret, evaluate, and restory. And I'm thinking about the GED here because this is critical thinking skills that are very much part of the GED instructional framework as we try to help them separate what was fact about the lead poisoning issue versus what are people's opinions or fears that were driving the discussion. Here are just some learner reactions to this text, which were just as diverse as we might have anticipated. That there's a gendered issue around, who has the authority to be able to make decisions about cooking, and I love the es machismo that he wanted to keep using the chumolera in the kitchen.
Okay,
Um,
hang on one second, Maricel. Linda, did you have a question or a thought? You had your hand up. Linda? Oh, okay. Let's keep going. Okay.
okay, and a lot of projects come out of this stories-based work. I think Learners' Lives as a curriculum framework is very closely aligned with a lot of principles underlying project-based instruction. And as part of that lead poisoning work, students develop chains, and each strip represents a tradition that they want to hold on to and a tradition they want to let go. The yellow are the ones they're adopting, and the blue-green ones are the ones that they were going to let go. So again, another opportunity to think how language can be archived and publicly shared, and giving their stories more of a reason to celebrate and dialogue with one another. We also
Maricel, the question that Linda wanted to ask was, what do you do with mixed level classes where immigrants can barely read due to the lack of schooling in their own language?
Yeah, so that's a great one because that was very much the context for this story. I'm going to just flip back. I hope that doesn't make anybody nauseous. I can share this lesson plan with you, but if you follow up with me via email, we actually read this in both Spanish and English, and we divided the classroom up where the students who could not read, they could hear it in Spanish first, and we gave them um, a series of pictures to be able to support their comprehension. But the follow-up activities, the language play activities, were to encourage them to develop more English skills, such that by the time we got to the role play, folks who were not so proficient were doing this bilingually, and those who were more advanced were doing it all in English. So not all contexts have that bilingual option, but the as I talked about earlier, the principle of adjusting the task, not the text, is the idea of trying to make sure the content is accessible to the learners, even if you change and vary the English learning activities. So here's another example where they were asked to share their knowledge, and this was in an attempt to build community. I think most ESL teachers are familiar with doing classroom recipe books. This one was more of a demonstration to practice oral skills about how to use a utensil from their kitchen, traditional utensil. I just wanted to show this one really quickly. This was a project that we did with ESL learners at a day laborer project. And most of them had very, very low level literacy skills and speaking skills. So what we did is we invited them to tell their story in their first language, and then we had them translated and created into a video. We then used those stories as the basis for language play activities. So this one was talk about, and these guys were all between the ages of 20 and 35 and all wanted to tell the worst accident story that they had experienced on the job as a day laborer. It's actually quite sobering because many of them do not have access to health care, but it provided them an opportunity to find out what was universal. Some of them had great bosses who helped pay for their medical their medical services. Others did not. But then this is also a great analytic skill where you compare your story using a Venn diagram to the stories that you just heard. Um, getting close towards the end here, in deciding what to talk about. I mean, there's perhaps you already know through needs assessment the themes that are going to be most resonant and important for your learners, but sometimes we don't always know that, or you're flipping through collaborations and stories to tell our children. So here's just some general guidelines that I think that are important to bear in mind. Choosing a story that has both content and emotional resonance. And the person who said earlier, you know, the best way to start is to tell your own story. If it's meaningful for you, if it's engaging for you, the students are going to pick up on that and may at least be interested long enough to tell a similar story or one that complements it. Has language that students need in order to tell their own stories. And this is where, you know, if they need the past tense, being able to look for stories that include models of the past tense being used in a way that's productive for you so that you can build on that, or has related vocabulary so that you can expand on it. Length, our stories are often no more than 6 or 7 sentences long because we work with learners that are no higher than high beginning. Um, you can vary that depending on how more advanced. You can go with longer stories. And then this idea of that there's always a community building dimension that is latent in the story or could be explicit, but the idea that something about the story could help build exchange, can help promote exchange of ideas, exchange of experiences in the classroom. Here's a sample prompt, the kinds of questions that a teacher might ask. And again, this is something that could be done early on in the class for those classrooms that have recent arrivals or even learners in refugee contexts. What do you love about your country? You can already see how it connects the past and the present. And this was a story written by a very low-level student. And I bring this up because you'll see that there's some grammatical infelicities here, some mistakes, and how do you deal with that? I love peace, my country. I feeling happy. I love people, my country. All people like to peace. In my country, one day the people said, please throw the gun away. So this was the story that came up. It was through multiple iterations that this ended up being the final one. Publishers would not allow this to be published in this form. Tends to be a premium placed on accuracy. But there's something about the cadence about this when I read it. I didn't read it in the most lyrical way. That actually, I think the fact that it has some grammatical inconsistencies makes it more authentic in some way. So I leave this for discussion with your teachers locally. Gail, and I would agree with her. My argument is that there is room for sentences that are not grammatically accurate if they're more expressive of the student's original intent. And I'm happy to take up that discussion at a different time if you would like to talk about that further. But I only show this one to say that stories do not have to be 100% grammatically accurate for them to be meaningful fodder for classroom activities. So in all of the last 90 seconds, and I apologize, this can't be more. What I was going to have you guys do is to think about Omar's story, or even to share something you're already thinking about doing, and the different kinds of language play activities. I place a premium on coming up with really good language play activities because that's where your skill as a teacher should shine. Very often learners have the ideas and they have the richness of experience, but it's our job to think about what are the ways that this can become the basis for language learning, language acquisition, is where you need to understand, well, where's the richness in terms of grammar, vocabulary, and discourse that really needs to be integrated into the lesson. So I'll stop there just so I can time check with Eric too.
Yeah, so Linda writes in that they use a story like Omar's and change it and ask the class to help correct it.
Yeah, you could do that. And, you could even, if Omar were in the classroom, you might have him lead that activity so that he is given authority as a writer, and that he can model the process of collecting peer feedback and deciding which edits make the most sense to him. I mean, I think again, the agency of the writer is important to preserve as well.
Well, and I think that approach models the fact that we revise on the basis of whether our message is heard, right? Not because we ingested Strunk and White and we need to make sure that we're consistent with that, right? So, I think this also goes back to the fact that we know that in ESL classes that teachers sometimes step in too early when two learners are trying to negotiate meaning between each other. Whether it's around an activity, whether it's around something that they want to communicate. And most often it's that negotiation process that's such an important part of language learning, right? Using different approximations and iterations of the language to kind of understand it. So I think the idea that the stories themselves are not going to be fixed the first time, I think it's natural and it leads to these sorts of negotiations in the classroom.
Absolutely.
David Rosen adds, in the Boston area, they published a literary journal of adult new readers called Need I Say More, which they accepted authentic language, including mistakes that the commercial publishers would not use. They were really popular. and they had the unexpected effect of encouraging other learners to write and publish. I believe, David, some of that Need I Say More is up on the web and accessible. Um, Still, Babette says that passes on from Autumn says help them write a poem to possibly prevent Omar from being embarrassed. So,
Mm.
so to give other ways of expressing yourself where you're not expected to follow the same sort of grammar or syntax rules.
And just to let you know, the poem idea is a great idea. In fact, the class wrote a song using these lyrics, and I just don't have it in the slideshow, but they wrote a song using Omar's words,
Hmm.
which allowed some of the grammatical infelicities to be less overt.
Any other sort of quick ideas that people want to share? I also think that when we do these sorts of activities, this is also a time for students to vent about English grammar. So, so if they're struggling with something and you're explaining, well, this is the way that we do it in English, and they're like, why? And you're like, because it's arbitrary, just like any other language. And you can say, yeah, I sympathize with you. It is stupid, but this is the way that we expect it to be said in particular forms of English.
Yeah. Um, Eric, would you like me to jump to my final slide?
Sure, I think so.
Okay. Well, I had other things to say, and um, offline, if anybody would love to talk about it, Gail loved the curricular piece. She's a materials developer at heart. I am not a materials developer, but I love this curriculum because I love the way it provides insights into interaction in classrooms, how learners connect to each other when the content is personal and or the content is personalized. Um, and I have the reason why I love this framework is that it enables me to understand how form and meaning can come into balance, but both be the driver of meaningful communication for our learners. And we really need more studies, more dialogue, more professional development about what that looks like at all levels of ESL. And that's where I feel that we have um, stopped short. There's lots of curricular directions, but we haven't slowed down our observational eyes to look at what's going on in classrooms up close. And when they're talking to each other, not just teacher-student talk. If you want to hear more about that, check in with me via email. I want to leave you with this quotation, which is one of my favorites. I don't exactly know the year, which is why the year is not specified, but I know Gail said this when she was on a trip to Palestine to do some peacemaking work where she was trying to use this curriculum to bring EFL teachers in Palestine and Israel together. And she said to them, telling our stories to one another is one way of making sense of our experience and of finding support to deepen and sustain our work. It becomes increasingly clear that it is also our burden to tell stories of learners and of teachers in order to make our case for the importance of ESL. Immigrants and their advocates begin to look heroic when the conditions under which we often teach and learn are illuminated. We need channels for telling stories within our classrooms, between our classrooms, and from our classrooms to a larger world that supports or undermines the conditions for our efforts. I want to thank everybody for their enthusiasm, and I really do mean that if you have follow-up questions or have an interest in publishing or have an interest in connecting into a wider network, to contact me. Perhaps there's an upcoming conference where people can meet and continue the conversation. Thank you, Eric, also for your facilitation.
Yeah, thank you, Maricel, and thanks everybody for chiming in with ideas. And I think that last quote I think is really important because oftentimes people's perspective on what the immigrant experience is, if they've never been an immigrant themselves, can be really, really skewed. So
Mm-hmm.
the idea that immigrants don't want to learn English when there's year-long waiting lists in some communities, or why don't they learn English in a year when we know how long it takes to learn a language? So, getting that story and the reality out there, I think, is really, really an important part of advocating for these communities and the members of the communities that we care about.